Okay, now you've cast on 35 stitches on your needle. That's what we need to make our little sample here. Now I told you you're going to learn several things about the sample. And technically we're right down here. We've just cast on this 35 stitches, and that's what it looks like right here. That's our 35 stitches. Now you get to start knitting. So to do that, we want to have our stitches move to where they're not spread out across your needle. You want them to come down kind of close together, not bunched up real tight, but remember, you want your stitches to move on your needle smoothly. If they don't, take it off, start over, cast on another 35 stitches. And the reason why I just keep really impressing that is you are training your hands and your brain right now in how you're creating a habit. You're creating how to get a proper gauge, and we're going to talk about the gauge a little bit more. I'm not going to bog your mind too much with that right now, but you want consistency, and how you're training your brain right now is going to affect the rest of your knitting. It's kind of like training a horse. Back in the day, we used to have horses, and sometimes you'd buy a horse from somebody else that had some bad habits, and you had to reteach that horse. And it's not easy to break old habits. And so if you can start out creating the proper habits right now, you will save yourself some disasters later on. Trust me. I know this from experience. So, okay. We're going to pick up our yarn like I showed you before, and it's actually under the little finger, coming up over the next index finger, under the middle finger, up over the index finger. I should have said ring finger down here. This is the index finger. And we're holding the yarn just like you were for when you were knitting your cast on, or if you did the long tail cast on, that's fine too, and you want 35 stitches. So we're going to knit a row all the way across. Now I knit with putting the needle, get down here, your stitches close to your point. You can't knit if your stitches are all back here away from the point. You want your stitches right down here close to the point. If you notice, these fingers are holding the rest of these stitches, so the only one that's really accessible is this first stitch. Now, my Swedish little grandma taught my sister and I to knit through the back of the needle, or back of the needle, and pick it up in the back of the stitch. Now I do know, and this method of knitting, by the way, is called continental stitching knitting. There's this type of knitting, and then you see some people throw the yarn. They have the yarn instead of your left hand, they have it over here in the right, and that works. I understand this, I've been told, is a little bit faster. May or may not be true, certainly not in the beginning, but I don't teach the throw method. I never learned it. So I'm just teaching you what my little Swedish grandma taught us as little girls. Now, I do know some people that knit continental do not pick up on the back of the stitch here. They actually go in to the front side and come around and pick up the stitch that way. And you can do that. I don't teach that method because that's not how I was taught. So I'm going to just teach you what I know. So needle in the back of that stitch, just like we used for cast on. And we're going to wrap the stitch around, pull it through, and now we have a stitch over here on our right hand needle. We slipped. I'm going to put that back on and show you again. This is very similar to what we did for casting on, but instead of putting the stitches back on this needle, now we're going to be moving them one by one over to the right hand needle. So again, we stick the point of our needle into the back of that stitch. If I hold it too close, I get out of focus right there. And we're wrapping around just like we did with the cast on. We're pulling that loop through. Now we have a loop on the right hand needle, but we have the original stitch on the left hand needle. And now that we're actually knitting and not casting on, we are going to slip this stitch off of the left hand needle, just like that. So now it's down here. Here's our new stitch we just made, and now we're going to make another stitch. Take the point of your right hand needle, slip it into the back of the next stitch that's on your left hand needle, wrap around, gently pull it through, and you have your second now stitch that you just knitted on your right hand needle, and we have to slip this stitch that's on the left hand needle off. Do that again. Slip your needle in, wrap it around, pull it through, and now I have my third stitch here, and I need to slip this third stitch off my left hand needle. There we go. Now we want to pull a little tension here, snug these stitches up, but not tight. You want the same movement right here. So, several things. If you're struggling to get your needle into this stitch, if it does not go in easily and you're having to pry, your cast on is way too tight. So at this point, I would say stop the video, pull everything off your needle, and cast on again. Don't continue with that foundation being too tight. Make yourself learn to do it right here, right now. You'll be grateful that you did. Something else to think about in knitting, and I know this is going to sound really, really crazy to you, but when I was in grade school and we had penmanship, I know they don't teach penmanship now, but you were taught how to do all kinds of movement with your hands, and the teacher would come by and she would literally tug on your pencil, and if it did not move out of your hands easily, you got downgraded because you were holding it too tight. Well, we want to do that with our knitting. We want to think about that. And your hands need to be relaxed. When you're knitting, if your hands are tight and you're holding onto this and the ends of your fingers are turning white because you've pinched it so tight that the blood has run out of the end of your fingers, your knitting is going to be tight. So think about it from the beginning. Knitting should be relaxing. Knitting should be relaxing to your hands. Your needle should move smoothly on both sides, and that is going to affect the quality of your knitting, and it'll keep you from knitting too tight, because that is a hard habit to break. The other thing you want to watch for, and you're going to say, oh my goodness, there's so many things to think about. Well, there are several things to think about, but they're all building structurally the foundation of what and how your knitting is going to turn out long term. So you want your hands relaxed. You don't want your index finger stretched way out. That's not proper. You'll lose the tension pretty soon because your finger can't move out any further. And so when you're picking up your yarn, I don't know, I have what maybe is that's about a 2-inch gap. You might do yours closer, and that's fine, but don't get way out here. And this left hand needs to be as relaxed as the right hand. So the other thing to remember to do when you're knitting is breathe. I know all of that sounds like really, I mean, this, you know, so many things to think about. Well, there are several things to think about, but this is, again, you'll get tired of me saying it, you're building your foundation. You're building a good foundation from the beginning versus having to correct and undo. Much harder to retrain the brain than to get it going correctly in the beginning. So we're going to continue to knit these stitches all the way across to the very end. And if you notice, when I knit, my left hand, my thumb, I kind of use it to help get this unwound here a bit. Use my left thumb to kind of help push my right needle back through. And if you notice, I use this finger a lot, like here, just to help guide. So your hands and fingers are working together, and you'll build that along the way. But now's the time to think about, okay, how is that needle really getting in those stitches smoothly? My hands and fingers are working together just like a pianist. You know, your left and right hand, they get trained. If you've ever taken piano lessons, there's fingering, like there's correct fingers to use on the keys in particular instance, and this is kind of what you do with knitting, is you're getting them to all work together. You're training your brain, you're training your fingers, you're remaining to stay relaxed, you're breathing, and it's all of a sudden it will catch on, and you begin to do this automatically. But the automatic doesn't happen until you've done this enough to build what that feels like to all your senses, except for you're not tasting it. So I guess you're not using all your senses. Okay, we're down here to the last stitch, comes off the needle, and we've now succeeded in knitting. This is the front side of your work, or we'll call it the knit side. So we've got 35 stitches knitted, 1 row. Let's turn it over and look at the differences from the front side to the back side. Your knitting tells you something. This little bump that you feel here on the back side, which is referred to as the purl side, feels quite differently than the front side. The front side, I'll show us over here. This is where every stitch is, every row is knitted. But up here is where I want to show you. This is smooth. This is called the knit side or the front side. Back here we have the little purl bumps. This is referred to as the purl side. So that's what I actually was showing you here. So now we've finished knitting 1 row. We're going to turn our work again. So now your yarn that you're knitting with is on pointing to the right. And we're going to knit a row back. We're actually looking at the purl side, but we're going to knit another row, and you're going to see what begins to happen. So we start out the same way. Stick your right hand needle into the stitch, pull it through, and you're just going to work your way across. Now, I realize I might be ahead of where you are. Stop the video, catch up, redo if you need to, and don't get too fussy over your looseness. If it's too tight, don't continue on. Pull it off, start over again. This is where you get your foundation started correctly. I'm just going to quickly finish knitting across this row. And if you're watching closely, watch what my fingers do. Watch what my thumb just did, my index finger just did. It just helps guide. Okay, now I could do this without using my thumb, but what happens is you begin to pull a lot of tension this way to get your needle out far enough to get that stitch to slip off of your left needle. So my thumb, what it does, get a stitch on there, my thumb helps pull my right needle back, so my needle is sliding back and I'm not going like this to get that stitch off. That stretches your yarn out. So that's why you don't want to do that. That's why the thumb helps glide this right hand needle. It actually pushes it back. It's sliding in these stitches right here, and it's getting it closer to the tip so that stitch slides right off. My right hand, my index finger, sometimes I use it to help push my left hand needle back so I keep my stitches here, rather than if you're getting your work down here, well, you can see you're away from the point. You can get your right hand needle in that stitch, but now how do you get it off? So often people go like this, and then they're like, and they're pushing and trying to slide this back. Well, to solve that problem, this is why I keep my knitting out here on the tip. I'm using my thumb and my index finger to help guide that. And it saves putting stress on the yarn. Now remember what I said about stretching your yarn past that springy place? Remember your tension. You want tension there, but not so tight that when these stitches go on this needle that they're in that real stressed place. Don't stress your yarn. Okay, we're almost to the end here of our 35 stitches. That's actually row 2 of knitting. Now we turn our knitting over, and guess what? We have a bump. We have a purl bump. This is actually the knit side. So when you knit on the knit side, you're going to get a smooth finish. When you knit on both sides, the front and the back, or the purl side, you're going to get a nubby row each row. So you end up putting a purl bump on the knit side when you knit every row. To accomplish this, which we will get there, you're going to knit one row. When we flip it, we'll be purling back in this section here. But right now, down here in this section, we are knitting every row. We're knitting on the knit side and we're knitting on the purl side. Now that will all start making more sense to you as we go along. So now we've done our cast on, we've done one knit row, we've done a second knit row, and now we're going to knit row 3. I'm actually going to write this out so you can begin to see what a knit pattern actually looks like. So we're going to knit actually 5 rows. And so you've got the instruction, just continue to knit for 5 rows. And how do we keep track of those 5 rows? Well, I'm going to show you some hints so you can figure out, oh, if you lay your knitting down and you come back to it and you think, oh my goodness, what row was I on? Was I on row 3? Was I on row 4? And sometimes it's even hard for me to remember by just looking at it. I can figure it out because you can read your knitting. We'll learn more about reading your knitting. But there's some easy things you can do along the way to keep track of where you are. So we're going to finish knitting across this row, and then we'll turn and come back. We're going to do that for 5 rows. My suggestion for keeping track of what row you're on, I have a couple of little things I do. Number 1, you can go get this little row counter. For every row that you do, you turn, you can see that, maybe see the little numbers, and this slips right on to your knitting needle. If you have one of those, that's great. You can use it. It just stays on your needle while you're knitting, so it's always right here. It's convenient. Another little thing that you can do, there is actually a program that goes on your phone. I use mine a lot. It's called Row Counter. It was free. I think there's probably several in the app store that you can get. Or you can use the good old-fashioned paper and pencil. And for instance, I know I need to do 5 knit rows. I will just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or you could make 5 marks, or you could put 5 pennies out here, whatever. But I like to do this method actually. So when I'm starting row 1, I'll circle it. And then when I'm done row 1, I'll put a line through it. And now I'm starting row 2. So row 2 will have a circle around it. The reason why I do that, I lay my work down, I go make a cup of coffee, I come back and I think, oh, did I finish row 2? Am I in the middle of row 2? Am I just starting row 2? By my circle, I know I've started row 2. I don't put a line through it until I've finished it, and then maybe I haven't started row 3 yet, so I don't put a circle around it. So for me, this is a very simple method, and sometimes I might have, 30 numbers down here. I often will do this, but I also use my row counter on my phone. It's super slick to use also, but for just a quickie, I use this method here. So now this is what your work should look like. Why 5 rows? Just because I thought of the number 5. We could have only done 3 rows, but I thought 5 rows is good practice. Okay, I've finished knitting to the end of my row. Going to turn our work. So now we're looking at the purl side, and we're going to again knit the first 5 stitches are knit. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now we're ready for our 25 purl stitches. So I'll try to do this slow again. So Make sure your hand is positioned right with your left hand is picked up your stitches, your yarn correctly. And we move the yarn to the front of our work so it's between us and the needle. And we're going to take our right needle and put it through from the back side of that first stitch, and it's really kind of pushing that yarn through that hole. Remember, with the knit we wrapped it this way. Well, we're not doing that with the purl side. Keep your work out here towards the end. So again, my right hand needle, put it through. I'm going to drop this down so you can see maybe a little bit better. Here is that stitch, and I'm going to put the point of that needle from the back side coming towards me. There's my yarn, and I'm going to just push it through that hole. And actually purling, this method, like I said before, is really even easier than knitting. I'm moving my yarn over here, so hopefully the camera is able to pick up what I'm actually doing there for you. So we're just going to purl again those 25 stitches. And remember, this is a sampler. This is practice. And don't be afraid to pull it out. I'm going to show you one other little fun trick. We call it frogging back. Let's just say for the fun of it that 4 stitches back here, there's a stitch that I just don't like the looks of. How do you get back to it without pulling everything out and having to start all over? Sometimes we need to do that, especially if our tension isn't good. But I'm going to show you how to get back to this 4th stitch without just pulling your needle completely out. Some yarns you can do that without it unraveling, but that's always kind of risky. So in order to go backwards to get to where there was a mistake, your left hand needle is, you've got your stitch that's on the needle and the one right underneath it. I heard a lady that is a sock knitter, and she refers to the stitch that's on the needle as the daughter. The stitch that's right under that is the mother, and the stitch under the mother is the grandmother. And I actually think that's kind of a good way to think about it in identifying where we are. So if that is true and the stitch on the needle is the daughter, the one underneath it's the mother, we're going to put our left hand needle into the mother. And then we're going to let the daughter slip off. We just took the needle off of the daughter. Left needle into the mother, and the daughter, the needle that's in the daughter, we're going to pull out, and it lets you drop that stitch out. Do that again. Left needle into the mother. Daughter's up here on the right needle. We're going to drop the right needle out of that and then pull that yarn, and let's pretend now we've undone the stitch that was incorrect, and we just then continue on with our purling. Try to give you some little tips like that along the way, so we're kind of working some techniques into some simple lessons. Trust me, there will be times that you need to frog. And if it's a long ways back and if it's on a sticky wool, you'll get to the point that you can actually just pull the needle out and unravel it. But a lot of yarn won't let you do that. Well, it'll let you do it, but it also unravels stitches that you don't want to unravel. So now we're down to our last 5 stitches, and remember those are a knit. So we're going to knit those 5 stitches, which gives us that rib border. Okay, now you can start seeing even better where we've got this knitted insert into this ribbed edging. And we're just going to continue to knit about 34 rows, and you can keep track of that or not, or you can begin to get really brave or knowledgeable, don't need to be brave to do it, and start counting. You know, you have 5 stitches here, 5 rows, excuse me, and then you can actually learn to count the stitches going up. What we're looking for is something close to a square for this practice piece. So being exact isn't really necessary, but just we want to do more than just a narrow strip. Try to go for a square, and when you've knitted far enough, you're going to knit your last 5 rows are all knit. We won't be purling, and so I'll meet you back to where we get to this border. So continue knitting, and I'll meet you back here in just a little bit. Okay, so here we are. We've now completed our knit 5 stitches, knit another 25 stitches, knit 5 stitches, and on the back side we just completed knit 5, purl 25, and knit another 5. So that leaves us here with our yarn off to the right, and now we're going to knit the next, I believe it's 4 rows. I've been saying 5, but I think it's 4. So I'm going to cut away and get my rows knitted. Correction, it is 5 rows. And the reason why it's 5 rows, when you start out on your first row of knitting all the way across, your work is facing you. So you knit across and back. You want to end up with, well, first of all, 3 big ridges here, but also end up to where your knitting is over here, and you're on the knit side versus being this way on the purl side. So it is 5 rows. I shouldn't have doubted myself. So this is what your work looks like at this point in time, and when we block this out, this will all straighten out if we decide to block it. But there is your first sample, maybe not quite a square, but we're calling it a square.